And now I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister. We're once again very pleased to see you as President of the Security Council, and we thank our Indonesian colleagues for proposing that we address the issue of protection of civilians in armed conflict. My words of thanks are also extended to the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Mr. Maura, and the Executive Director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict, Mr. Federico Borello, for their contribution to this discussion. Over the last 20 years, the subject of protection of civilians has taken a particular place in the Security Council. The Council has adopted a number of important resolutions that define the UN's work and set universal standards in this area. Without question, the work of the Security Council over these years has helped strengthen the protection of civilians and helped save lives. Nonetheless, the number of victims in armed conflict, among them many women and children, is unacceptably high. There has been a change in the character of armed confrontation, and that has brought with it new challenges. And answers to these can be found only through continuing dialogue and uniting efforts to prevent conflict and find peaceful settlement to it. Only such an approach, founded on international law in its traditional understanding, and without dreaming up any artificial concepts, can give us positive results. Madam President, today we see a particular threat stemming from terrorist groups involved in armed conflicts. The standard for such groups includes mass executions, the use of civilian facilities as cover, and also using civilians as human shields, creating an obstacle for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. The sobering statistics for civilian victims of terrorism confirm the need for additional mobilization of efforts from states, the United Nations, and humanitarian organizations to strengthen the mechanisms to fight the global terrorist threat. Without any doubt, terrorist activity should be suppressed with sensible and proportional force. We are concerned, for example, by the broadening practice of using combat drones. They are difficult to control, and they bring with them civilian casualties, which is what we're seeing in particular from the situation in Afghanistan, for example. We are also concerned by civilian deaths and also the psychological stress that civilians are victims of when living under the constant threat of destructive missile strikes. Madam President, there is an important factor in protecting civilians, and that is the humanitarian component. The work of humanitarian structures should be built on the basis of the UN Charter and basic humanitarian principles. We roundly reject the use of humanitarian pretexts for criminal ends, to support terrorists and to broaden disinformation. The notorious white helmets in Syria, and they are mainly who we are talking about, in what they are doing are not only severely damaged the Syrian peace process, but have also significantly compromised the international humanitarian movement. There is an unprecedented politicization of the humanitarian sphere in humanitarian relations. That's what we're seeing today, and this doesn't help us achieve our high end of protecting the civilian population and minimizing suffering. The focus of humanitarian aid should always be efforts to help citizens in need and not political objectives. This is also an issue for evaluating humanitarian needs, which should be carried out in close coordination with the authorities of the host country, as is required by the fundamental resolutions of the UN General Assembly. Unfortunately, the office within the Secretariat that is responsible for evaluating such needs does not always succeed in complying with this rule. We encourage it to pay greater attention to this issue in the future. Last but not least, Madam President, recently, within specialized international organizations in the civilian sector and also in academic circles, we've seen a kind of sporting contest arise of who can think up the most interesting new fad for discussion under the issue of protection of civilians in armed conflict. Unfortunately, The Security Council has also been affected by this infection. If you please, there is no need to develop new international legal concepts which allegedly fulfill the shortcomings in the Geneva Convention's protection regime. We shouldn't get distracted by the endless identification of new categories of person who need particular protection under international law. In practice, such ideas can only weaken the protection given to civilians. The Council's objective should be to concentrate on practical work to guarantee protection of civilians within the framework of the current international legal standards and the prevailing mandate. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement.